Historically, there have been many reasons for gun control. In the early 1300s, when guns first made their way into Europe, the King of Great Britain went about banning weapons of any kind to be carried near him, his ministers, or in public, punishable by prison, and this was obviously to keep his subjects in line. The Founding Fathers even banned guns for white loyalists because they were concerned that the loyalists might fight for the British. And in 1934, Congress and Franklin Roosevelt passed the National Firearms Act, which imposed sweeping registration and taxation requirements in an effort to curb gun violence related to the mob. Of course, never mind that this mob violence was exacerbated by Prohibition-era laws, but leave it to the government to pass a law to fix problems that a previous law created. Nevertheless, one of the most telling and compelling histories of gun control is its racist history and how it was built into the foundation of America. The Founding Fathers denied the right to own guns not just to white loyalists, but to both slaves and free black men. This shouldn't be surprising, considering they would go on to write slavery into the Constitution. In Virginia, before the South's secession, free blacks were allowed to possess firearms with a special license, but after Nat Turner's slave rebellion in 1831, that right was entirely repealed. After the Civil War, the South enforced the historic Black Codes, one of which was to deny black Americans the right to own guns. The KKK patrolled the South armed, enforcing these laws and terrorizing people. Neither of these instances of prejudiced gun control is particularly surprising because racism was so deeply embedded in society during those times. However, by the 1960s, racism was supposed to have been eliminated by government measures such as the Supreme Court decision Brown versus the Board of Education in 1954, the Civil Rights Act of 1964, and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. But unfortunately, many black Americans recognized that they were still subject to institutionalized racism from the system. Before his assassination, activist Malcolm X argued that in areas where the government has proven unable or unwilling to defend the lives and the property of Negroes, it is time for Negroes to defend themselves. He plainly stated that Article No. 2 of the Constitutional Amendments provides you and me the right to own a rifle or a shotgun. Militant Black Panther groups inspired by Malcolm X arose in an attempt to stand up for rights they felt were violated, most egregiously by police officers. While the militantly socialist philosophy of the Black Panthers was clearly misguided, they did understand the importance of their right to be armed, especially in a society that historically and continued to violently oppress them with the force of the state. To combat this, Black Panther leaders Huey Newton and Bobby Seale began policing the police not with cameras like people do today, but with their guns. Many Black Panthers followed suit, and they could do this because at the time in California it was legal to open carry as long as your weapon was registered. So the Black Panthers would follow cops around, and when they pulled over black drivers, the Panthers would stop too. They would stand on the sidelines with their weapons at their sides and shout legal advice to those who had been pulled over. When Donald Mulford, a Republican assemblyman for the state of California, found out about this, though, he was determined to pass gun control legislation. In an ambitious response to this, on May 2, 1967, 30 Panthers marched peacefully into the state capitol armed with their weapons. This only prompted the Mulford Act to be harsher and more hastily passed, supported by Republicans and then Governor Ronald Reagan. But the trend of gun control wasn't limited to stifling Black Panther dissent. That summer, violent, contentious race riots in cities like Detroit and Newark erupted out of similar frustrations with systemic oppression. While rioters may have falsely assumed the government should fix their situation, they, like the Black Panthers, understood that to combat state oppression and violence, they needed to be armed. The following year, in 1968, the Kerner Commission report blamed the violence, at least in part, on the easy accessibility of guns. It also blamed a lack of housing, jobs, and education, all three of which had been worsened by government meddling. Still, the report called for government to become more involved in these areas. It acknowledged police brutality, but overwhelmingly blamed societal white racism as the cause for Black discontent, calling for increased police surveillance of Black communities. The Kerner Commission influenced lawmakers and coincided with the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. and the riots that ensued. The shooting of Robert F. Kennedy was the final straw, and the next day, the Omnibus Crime Control and Safe Streets Act of 1968 was passed. This law prohibited the sale of handguns between states and raised the age to own a gun to 21. Among other things, it set rules for the government to obtain wiretaps and increased FBI funding by 10%, most of which went to training police at their National Academy in riot control. The riots continued throughout 1968, in that October, the Gun Control Act of 1968 was passed by Congress and signed by President Lyndon Johnson. One provision banned the ownership of guns for individuals who had been convicted of an offense that carried a year or more of jail time. When the racist drug war emerged a few years later, this provision would apply vastly to the overwhelming numbers of blacks and minorities convicted under it. These two gun control acts together were the first major pieces of gun legislation to be passed since FDR's National Firearms Act, highlighting the urgency the government felt to quell outbreaks of dissent. While racism is by no means the only factor in the history of gun control, this little-known but influential aspect of history acutely exposes the intentions of government. Whether it's 14th century Great Britain or 18th, 19th, or 20th century America, the government has routinely displayed an intention and lust for control. And while this lust for control may have only applied to minorities, whatever kind they may have been, this is an age where government asserts that humans are its property through excessive, involuntary taxation to fund financial elites, corporate industry, invasive spying, militarized and trigger-happy police forces that brutalize individuals of all colors now, and perpetual war. It criminalizes free speech and the right to peaceably assemble, calling for gun control while using taxpayer dollars to arm its agents to the teeth. The history of African Americans and gun control is not a relic of the past. It is not an issue of left or right. It's a universal lesson in the brutality of government against those who stand up to it when it tramples their rights.